What's up, gamers? Now, you might find yourself with a brand new console and can't wait to play these new games, but you might find yourself wondering why your game's on a cartridge or a disc. But not to worry though, we can answer that by going all the way back to the beginning.
The year is 1975. The only home console is the Magnavox Odyssey, where to play games you have to insert a printed circuit board into a slot. This could technically be stated as the first cartridge design, but the cartridges were labeled with numbers, so I wouldn't really count it. I mean, imagine if instead of, hey, wanna go play some Overwatch, it was, hey, wanna go play some game 3117? There were also multiple consoles needed to play one or two more games than just the standard system. Thankfully, this didn't stick around either, because could you imagine having to plug in and out different Xboxes just to play a few more games? Game cartridges were first truly introduced with the Fairchild Channel F. This was due to a man named Gerald Anderson Lawson, who had been experimenting with video games himself for quite a while, considering he made his very own arcade game in his garage. Lawson, with the help of a few others, had to convert a prototype using an Intel CPU chip, Fairchild's competitor at the time, to a Fairchild F8 chip. But then Fairchild realized that it was quite hard to remove and insert the game chips into the system, as well as them being quite fragile. Because if you throw an NES cartridge, it'll probably be fine, but if you throw a computer chip, let's just say good luck. So, basing the shell around an 8-track tape cartridge, an audio recording format used during the 1970s in car audio systems, they made a way to keep the game safe while making it easily accessible using only one hand. Sadly though, Gerald Lawson's work goes often overlooked due to the Atari 2600 being the one to popularize games and gaming cartridges by proxy. This would eventually cause Atari's downfall though, and the video game crash of 1983. Atari just didn't put any limitations in place for Atari games, so anyone and everyone made Atari games. And with other consoles coming out that allowed you to play Atari games from the start, Atari consoles just failed and the home console medium became too expensive and complicated, so games just stuck to arcades. Until Nintendo happened. It took what worked in the gaming industry and ran with it. By now we all know the story of how Nintendo brought back home consoles and made them mainstream again, but you should know about the cartridges that they used. Considering the games were now 8-bit and held 64 kilobytes to 512 kilobytes, the cartridges had to be much bigger to fit the larger chip sizes, so they used this design. They made it quite big and used a stronger material due to the console being marketed towards kids, basically meaning they had to make sure the cartridges could withstand kids not being exactly gentle with them. Then onto 16-bit cartridges, where Nintendo does more of the same with the SNES. The cartridges could now hold 512 kilobytes to 16 megabytes, but the largest game actually ever produced for the system was only 8.75 megabytes. Also, in some of these cartridges, there's a fancy new Super FX chip, which could give some of the games the illusion to look 3D, or just made them run better. The cartridge shell itself also uses a similar material to the NES cartridges, but due to the console being a top loader, it goes for more of a wide design rather than a tall one. But there was more than just the Super Nintendo this generation, and that was the Sega Genesis, Sega's big console to try to overthrow Nintendo's monopoly over the market. This was somehow in their mind through a bunch of variations to the console and expansions. Great. Starting off with just the standard cartridges for the system, the carts only had a range of 2 megabytes to 4 megabytes, but Sega managed to push a 5 megabyte game with Super Street Fighter 2. Then, for the design, it uses the same shape as the Master System carts, but it has rounded corners. The 32X carts are also quite like this, sharing a similar design with a few small changes, as you can see here. But, as you'd expect, it also has a larger storage capacity. The first instance of discs in gaming, the Sega CD. As you might imagine based on the name, it was a Sega Genesis add-on that used CDs instead of cartridges. The basic purpose of the add-on was much like the Sega 32X, where it was just to make bigger games for the system. It did surprisingly have the ability to play videos within the games. Other than that, it was basically just the middle ground between the Genesis and Sega Saturn. Oh yeah, the Sega Saturn. The Sega Saturn, hardware-wise, might as well be if the Sega CD and 32X combined, due to it being a 32-bit CD-based console. The CD itself was also not that large of an improvement, if any at all, to the Sega CD from what I can tell.
I am still wondering how people didn't get confused by Sega's naming conventions.
Now, you might be wondering why the Sega CD and Saturn aren't praised for converting the gaming medium into discs, and it's because just like the original creation of gaming cartridges, they were overshadowed, and in this case by the Sony PlayStation. Sony had originally been making their own CD expansion for the Super Nintendo, but when plans fell through, Sony decided to make their own console, and this was perfect for them due to them and Philips creating a version of the CD-ROM called the Green Book, and after a few variations to it, the CD-ROM XA was made, which was used by Sony for their PlayStation games. But of course, there's Nintendo. They must have heard that game companies wanted discs due to the bigger size and cheaper costs, so Nintendo being Nintendo, they still went with cartridges instead. The cartridges use again around the same material as the SNES and NES cartridges, but it was smaller than both cartridges while still holding 16 megabytes to 64 megabytes. But Nintendo still suffered from sticking to cartridges, so they would obviously switch to DVDs or CDs with their next console, right?
I mean, did you really believe Nintendo wouldn't mess it up again?
The GameCube, where Nintendo decided it wanted to lose even more money. Instead of doing the obvious choice and making the console around normal DVDs like its competitors, instead, Nintendo wanted to be cute and made it around tiny 8cm DVDs. I'm not joking, they really are that small. But at least it makes sense why the disc itself only has around 1.46 gigabytes of space though. Basically meaning developers were forced to compress their games if it was being made or ported for the GameCube, but at least Sega would get it right though.
Let's be honest, as soon as you heard the word Sega, you knew they got it wrong.
Instead of going with the DVDs for the Dreamcast, Sega wanted to pull a Nintendo, so basically, they messed up. They decided on their own disc format made by Yamaha, called Gigabyte Discs, which stored a max of around 1.2 gigabytes of data. Real original, Sega. The two innermost tracks of the disc were formatted to the normal yellow book CD-ROM track, and the red book audio track. Then the third track was used as a separator, with the fourth track holding the game data, but because of how it was formatted, it could hold more information, but needed a special drive to read it. Moving on to the PlayStation 2 and Xbox, they used DVDs, which made a lot of sense at the time due to movies also switching to DVDs, but there were also different DVD versions, which usually just boiled down to different amounts of space. A notable instance of this is with the Xbox using its own file system to serve as some copyright protection. DVDs would also continue into the next generation with the Xbox 360, Wii, and Wii U. Where the Xbox 360 had more of the same, Nintendo used their own types of discs, which in my opinion just seemed like modified DVDs. But you might be wondering about the PlayStation 3 though. Since Sony at the time was one of the developers of Blu-ray technology, they decided to go with Blu-ray discs for their next console. The Blu-ray disc itself is 12 centimeters in size, but was surprisingly able to hold 25 gigabytes of space or 50 gigabytes if it had dual layers. This was accomplished by packing tracks so tight that it needed a 405 nanometer blue laser. This format would then become the gold standard for both PlayStation and Xbox to this day with the PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X.
I don't know though, I feel like I'm still missing some kind of modern console that decided to go back to an old format. Oh yeah,
I mean, were you really expecting a disc to fit in this anyway? Nintendo decided to make a hybrid system, which means they need to make it playable on the go. And nobody wants to lug around a giant system just because it plays discs, so portables have always used cartridges, and it just made sense for the Switch as well. The cartridges in the Switch are tiny and somehow still manage to fit 1 to 32 gigabytes of space. They also, for some reason, are made to taste gross. But other than that, the Game Boy and Game Boy Advance used cartridges that had a max of 8 megabytes and 32 megabytes respectively. Then for the DS and 3DS, they had sizes that range from 8 megabytes to 512 megabytes and 125 megabytes to 8 gigabytes. Also, I mean, technically the PSP used a form of discs, but they were even tinier than the GameCube discs, so you can't really count them.
Now that you know what to look for when buying some games for your new system, I guess my work here's done. Wait, your console's digital only? Why didn't you say that from the start?